Intern gets pregnant by CEO, but a DNA test reveals a secret that changes everything. Emily Harper walked into the lobby of Hastings Corporation with a purposeful stride, her gaze steady, carrying a determination that left no room for doubt. London was shrouded in its usual morning mist, but nothing seemed to waver her focus as she approached the towering building. Though she was just an intern, every detail of her posture, from the sharp cut of her suit to the subtle yet firm tilt of her chin, radiated the ambition of someone who had come to make her mark. Since securing the internship, Emily had been studying Hastings Corporation with the precision of a general surveying the battlefield. She observed the team's routines, mentally noted who wielded influence and who had lost their edge over time. Most importantly, her gaze was set on the man at the top of the power chain, Ethan Blake, the CEO. Ethan Blake was known for his relentless leadership style and the mystery surrounding his personal life. Tall, polished, and with a perpetually analytical expression, he commanded the room around him like it was a stage, and he was the lead actor. At 37, Ethan had transformed the company into an empire, and his name was respected and feared, both in London and abroad. To Emily, he was not just an inspiring leader. He embodied everything she wanted: power, status, and respect. But Emily's feelings for Ethan were more than just admiration. There was a calculated ambition behind every action. She knew that to achieve the success she so craved, effort and talent alone would not be enough. She needed a powerful ally, someone who could elevate her to new heights, and Ethan Blake was the key to her plan. She was determined to approach him subtly, but effectively, without letting on that every gesture was part of a well-thought-out scheme. Sometimes, alone in her tiny apartment, Emily questioned if she was being too bold, if she was risking losing herself in this obsessive pursuit of success. Growing up, she had learned that to survive in this world, she needed both strength and pragmatism. But how far was she willing to go? She hesitated for a moment, but quickly brushed these doubts aside. Ethan was her sure path, her chance to escape the dull life she lived and achieve something that few dared even to dream about. She was willing to take the risk, to test the limits of ethics if it meant getting where she wanted. In her first days on the job, Emily studied the internal dynamics, the political plays within departments, and most importantly, she observed Ethan with a sharp eye. She noted how he walked, how his serious and distant gaze conveyed a kind of natural authority everyone respected and feared. She began to attend every meeting he was in, every event where she might encounter him, always calculating each word, every smile. One day, she found her opening. She was waiting to deliver an important report when she noticed Ethan approaching, his eyes focused on something distant. She took a deep breath, straightened her posture, and addressed him with a firm yet cordial tone. "Good morning, Mr. Blake." He stopped and looked at her, surprised, as if he wasn't used to being interrupted like that. "Good morning. Harper, right?" he replied, his analytical gaze seeming to evaluate every aspect of her. Emily didn't hesitate, seizing the moment. "Yes, Emily Harper. I've prepared a report analyzing the impact of recent strategies in the financial sector. If you'd like, I can highlight some key points to optimize our upcoming actions." Ethan observed her in silence for a few seconds, betraying no emotion, then nodded. "Bring the report to the conference room tomorrow morning. We'll see if it's worth it." His tone was serious, but to Emily it was a small victory. She knew she had made her first move, and that from then on, she would have more opportunities to prove herself. That night, hunched over the desk in her tiny apartment, Emily reviewed every detail of the report. It wasn't just a document, it was a vital piece of her strategy. She spent the night reorganizing ideas, refining arguments, mentally rehearsing the responses she would give if he challenged her. Amid the silence, a small voice whispered her insecurities. Was it really worth it? Was her desire to climb the corporate ladder taking more from her than she realized? But she quickly dismissed these thoughts. There was no time for hesitation. She was closer than ever to gaining the CEO's trust, and one step closer to her goal. The next morning, Emily prepared with the same care as a soldier going into battle. When she finally entered the conference room with the report in hand, she found Ethan already waiting. He greeted her with a slight nod and an attentive look. "Go ahead, Harper." Emily kept her tone steady and started her presentation, controlling every word, every pause, observing how he reacted. When she finished, Ethan paused briefly and then said, "You have a sharp eye, Harper. It's rare to see someone grasp the impact of our operations with such clarity." He didn't smile, but to Emily it was the highest praise she could receive. From that moment, something shifted between them. He started to notice her, inviting her to smaller meetings and asking her about significant details. Emily knew she was making progress, slowly getting closer to the most powerful man at Hastings. But she also began to feel something she hadn't expected. The admiration she felt for him was turning into a deeper, more personal interest. It didn't take long for their casual encounters to become more frequent, until one particular evening marked the beginning of a new phase for both of them. After a significant company presentation, a celebration dinner was held at a fancy restaurant, and Ethan was there. Emily took special care that night, choosing an elegant but understated dress that highlighted her confidence and beauty. During the dinner, she noticed Ethan watching her from a distance, their glances meeting now and then. Later, when most of the guests had left, he approached her. "Emily," he said, his gaze fixed on her, "you impressed everyone today. It's rare to see someone handle pressure so well. For me, working at Hastings is more than just an internship, Mr. Blake," Emily replied with a subtle smile. "It's an opportunity to achieve something grand." Her words felt more sincere than she intended, but at that moment, she felt there was no turning back. Ethan looked at her for a few seconds longer and, in an unexpected gesture, invited her to have coffee in a more private area of the restaurant. During their conversation, he shared stories of his journey and the challenges he faced to get where he was. Emily listened closely, using the charm she knew was one of her greatest assets. She saw in those moments not just a chance to get closer, but an opportunity to understand more about the man who dominated her thoughts and who was the central piece of her plan. As they left the restaurant, the subtle touch of his hand on hers was a confirmation that something had changed. Emily knew at that moment that she was getting closer to achieving what she always wanted, but a small voice in the back of her mind wondered if, in the end, the price she would pay for this path would be too high. She brushed the doubt aside, determined to keep moving forward. The room was impeccably set. The event hall of the luxurious hotel in Kensington radiated elegance and sophistication, with crystal chandeliers reflecting soft lights, creating an almost ethereal glow. Hastings Corporation was hosting a celebration for the launch of a new project, something that had been in the works for months. The guests were elite executives and clients, prominent figures in London's corporate world. For Emily, that night was more than just a celebration. It was her golden chance, the perfect opportunity to solidify the professional and personal relationship she had been cultivating with Ethan Blake, the man who embodied her dream of ascension. Emily had devoted months to this plan, playing it subtly but firmly, making herself noticeable to Ethan at calculated moments. It hadn't been easy, but over time, her efforts began to pay off. Ethan included her in significant discussions, sought her opinions in meetings, and looked at her more frequently than before. She knew that for someone like him, reaching this point wasn't a mere coincidence. But tonight, amid the glamour and the gazes of the attendees, Emily sensed that there was something different in the air. For the occasion, she chose a simple black dress that radiated an undeniable elegance. Paired with makeup that accentuated her eyes, she exuded a blend of sophistication and mystery that drew discreet, admiring glances. As the guests mingled throughout the room, chatting in groups and enjoying cocktails, Emily kept an eye on Ethan. The CEO was a few meters away from her, engaged in conversation with investors. He displayed his usual confidence, but Emily noticed something different in his gaze, a spark she couldn't quite decipher. As the night progressed, Emily saw her chance when Ethan finally stepped away from the group. She followed him discreetly, making sure it wasn't too obvious, until she found him alone on the balcony, watching the lights of London in the distance. It was rare to see Ethan so isolated, as if he was allowing himself a brief respite. Emily's heart raced, but she kept her expression calm as she approached. "Need some air, Mr. Blake?" she asked with a light smile, one that hinted at a touch of boldness. Ethan looked at her, studying her as he always did, with that enigmatic gaze. But this time, there was something more. He sighed, and to Emily's surprise, he offered a faint smile, almost as if he was letting his guard down. "Yes, Harper. Sometimes it's nice to get away from the crowd." She stepped closer, looking out at the city lights alongside him. "Even someone like you needs a moment of rest. I never imagined you were so human, Mr. Blake." Ethan let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "It's good to remember that even the most focused have moments of exhaustion." He turned to her, and for a moment, the silence was palpable. Ethan seemed to really see her, as if he was looking beyond the professional front that Emily maintained. She seized this rare moment of vulnerability. "Working at Hastings has been one of the most intense experiences of my life," she confessed, her gaze sincere with a hint of admiration. "You're a huge inspiration, Ethan. This empire you've built, it's admirable." His name slipped from her lips softly, like a confession, something she allowed to pass on purpose, breaking the formality between them. Ethan looked at her, and she noticed the intensity in his eyes. For a moment, the powerful, always focused man seemed to hesitate, as if considering the implications of what he was feeling. He then gently touched her hand, a brief touch that sent a shiver through Emily's body. Without a word, Ethan moved away from the balcony and motioned for her to follow him. Without a second thought, Emily followed his steps down the long corridor of the hotel, leaving behind the murmurs and lights of the party. They walked in silence to the elevator. The tension between them was palpable, as if each was testing the other's limits. When the elevator doors closed, Ethan gently pulled her closer, his eyes fixed on hers. Emily realized that this moment had turned into a kind of silent game, where words were unnecessary. He leaned towards her, and before she could think, he kissed her. Ethan's kiss was firm but unexpectedly soft, and Emily felt herself wrapped in a sensation she had never experienced. When they reached the desired floor, Ethan guided her to a suite. Emily knew this wasn't an impulsive move. He wanted her, just as she had wanted this moment for so long. With each gesture, each touch, she felt closer to her goal, but at the same time, a flood of emotions overwhelmed her. She had dreamed of this encounter as a step in her ascent, but now, in Ethan's arms, it was hard to separate what was strategy from what was genuine desire. That night was intense, filled with a passion that surprised even Emily. Ethan revealed a vulnerability she hadn't imagined, and she allowed herself to be drawn into that more human side she had never glimpsed before. The feeling of being by his side, sharing an intimacy beyond what anyone at the office could imagine, left her in a mix of fulfillment and fear. This was the chance she had pursued, but now she faced something she never expected. The feeling that, by crossing this line of intimacy, she had also approached a dangerous boundary. At dawn, Emily woke up to find Ethan by her side, still asleep. The powerful man, the always-in-control CEO, looked surprisingly vulnerable as he slept, as if at that moment he was just an ordinary man, with fears and dreams. Emily watched him for a few seconds, absorbing the moment, but soon her ambition pulled her back. This relationship was a tool for her advancement. She couldn't allow herself to be deceived. As she dressed, she reflected on what that night meant. Her mind was torn between genuine attraction and her need to progress professionally. Could she separate personal feelings from her career plan? Could she stay detached enough to use this relationship to her advantage? These questions echoed in her mind as she tried to compose herself before Ethan woke. He awoke shortly after, and the air between them was strange, as if both knew something had changed. Ethan looked at her with that same intense and serious gaze, as if trying to interpret what was happening between them. He said nothing about the previous night, only commenting that she could return to work later, indicating a certain professionalism that, as odd as it was, reassured her. He was willing to carry on as if nothing had happened, which, for Emily, was a sign that everything was going according to plan. As she left the hotel, Emily felt a mix of victory and unease. She knew she had made progress in her goal, that she now had a closer bond with the CEO. But at the same time, there was something about that night that had unsettled her. She couldn't deny the genuine desire she felt, and how that involvement made her question her own limits. Could she stay firm in her ambition without letting her relationship with Ethan lead her off track? Emily continued her journey to the office, striving to regain her composure and eliminate any doubts from her mind. She knew she needed to stay focused while managing this new connection. Deep down, though, a small voice whispered that maybe she had crossed a delicate line. Ethan Blake wasn't just a professional conquest, but a man who could change the game, for better or for worse. Over the next few weeks after her encounter with Ethan, Emily's life was filled with tension and uncertainty. Her plans seemed to be unfolding exactly as she had imagined. Ethan appeared more attentive, increasingly interested in her work, and her involvement in company projects had become constant. Emily spent most of her days buried in the reports and meetings Ethan now included her in frequently, as if she were an essential part of his decision-making. Yet, in the midst of this seemingly triumphant rise, she began to notice small changes in herself that left her feeling unsettled. At first, it was just moments of slight fatigue, which she dismissed. Working long hours was part of the game, and she knew she had to impress Ethan at every opportunity. But soon after, the fatigue was accompanied by an unusual feeling. Something felt off in her body, a deep exhaustion that wouldn't go away, like she was constantly at the edge of her strength. Emily didn't want to admit it, but soon the nausea began, subtle at first, then intensifying each morning. One afternoon, as she tried to focus on a presentation, her stomach turned violently. She rushed out of the room, barely hearing her colleagues' concerned questions. Locking herself in the bathroom, she felt tears of fear and frustration stream down her face. Taking a deep breath, she tried to compose herself. At that moment, a troubling suspicion began to form in her mind, but she shoved it aside, as if the very thought were poison. But as the days passed, the symptoms became more frequent and undeniable. Emily felt her world unraveling around her. She had spent so long orchestrating her moves, crafting a meticulous plan to reach her goals, that the possibility of a pregnancy felt like a cruel irony. She fought against the suspicion as long as she could, clinging to the idea that it was just a minor health issue, maybe stress from the projects, the workload, anything but this. But on one particularly difficult morning, she decided to face what she feared and bought a pregnancy test, hoping it was just her mind playing tricks. As she waited, sitting in the small chair in her bedroom, her hands trembling as she held the tiny device, those few minutes felt like an eternity. When she finally looked at the result, her eyes filled with tears she couldn't hold back. The positive result was a painful confirmation, a blow that tore at her heart and left her mind in chaos. She was pregnant with Ethan Blake's child, the man who had been her stepping stone to power, but had never been part of any plan beyond that. How had this happened? How, amidst all her strategies and maneuvers, had she not foreseen this risk? The initial shock quickly gave way to a deep anguish. What would she do now? Her plan for advancement seemed to crumble before her eyes. She felt betrayed by her own ambition, by the situation that, in such a cruel twist, had arisen to threaten everything she had built. She felt torn between anger and overwhelming sadness. Holding the positive test in her hands, she stared at a future she had never imagined. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. Each time she closed her eyes, Ethan's image surfaced in her mind. How would he react? Their relationship had never gone beyond a convenient connection, a rung she had used to climb to her goal. But now, things had changed in a way she couldn't control. She tried mentally rehearsing the conversation, the arguments she would use to explain the situation, but it all felt hollow. She knew that Ethan valued absolute control over every aspect of his life, and now she represented a threat to that control. She wondered if he would see her as untrustworthy, or worse, if he would try to push her out of his life and the company for good. By morning, the physical and mental exhaustion was clear on her face. She tried to pull herself together before going to work, applying makeup to cover the pale look of her skin and the dark circles from her sleepless night. She walked to Hastings Corporation with a mix of fear and determination, knowing that at any moment she would have to face Ethan, and that this would be decisive. She felt as if she were walking a tightrope, where any misstep could destroy her chances of keeping what she had achieved. However, as she rode the elevator up, she realized that this wasn't her only problem. There was something deeper at stake. The baby she carried represented both a threat and an opportunity. In the days that followed, Emily continued going to work without mentioning anything to Ethan, though the anxiety consumed her. She felt betrayed by her own body, by the signals she could no longer ignore. One afternoon, while analyzing some reports, exhaustion took over, and she found herself resting her head on the desk. Tears began to well up again, and in that moment, the image of her mother came to mind. She remembered how her mother had always told her that life didn't always go according to plan, but Emily, in her rebellious youth, had never paid attention to that advice. Now she understood what it meant to lose control, and the feeling terrified her. Days later, driven by a desperate need for answers and advice, Emily scheduled a doctor's appointment. She knew she needed to face this reality, no matter how harsh it was, and hearing the doctor confirm her pregnancy was nearly as intense a blow as the initial test. As he talked about care and guidelines, Emily felt her heart race, her emotions swirling in a whirlwind. Leaving the clinic, she walked aimlessly through the streets of London, feeling alone, lost in a city that had once represented her dreams and now seemed indifferent to her pain. Back at home, Emily sat on the floor of her bedroom, her hand on her stomach, trying to process what this would mean for her life and her plans. Tears streamed down as she reflected on all that this baby represented: a new life, a link to Ethan, but also a threat to her own dreams of power. Amidst the sorrow, she began to question just how much of her ambition she was willing to sacrifice. And above all, she feared the moment she would have to look Ethan in the eye and tell him the truth. She knew that once she revealed the pregnancy, nothing would ever be the same, and perhaps her entire plan for advancement would come crashing down. Emily spent days rehearsing what she would say to Ethan. Every time she tried to imagine his reaction, her stomach churned, a mix of fear and anxiety overwhelming her. Since discovering the pregnancy, the internal chaos seemed to control her life, but she knew she needed to be strategic. Ethan Blake was not a man who reacted well to surprises, especially not one so intimate and, for him, potentially devastating. The decision to reveal the pregnancy didn't come easily. Emily spent sleepless nights, weighing whether it would be better to keep everything a secret and continue the pregnancy on her own. Yet in each of those nights, the image of the baby inside her reminded her that this was the strongest bond she could have with Ethan, a chance that might open doors to a future she had never imagined. She was willing to turn this situation into an opportunity for advancement. When she finally decided to confront him, she chose a day when he would be less busy, hoping he'd be in his office to avoid any witnesses. She took several deep breaths before approaching the door, trying to control her internal turmoil. She felt divided between the certainty that this revelation could strengthen her position at Hastings and the visceral fear that everything might fall apart. Ethan was a calculating man, and she knew that even in personal matters, he would analyze everything with the precision of someone who runs an empire. Entering his office, she found Ethan standing, reviewing some documents on the desk. He quickly looked up at her with his usual serious expression before returning his attention to the papers. Emily observed his firm posture, hands on the desk, his expression conveying an almost unshakable confidence. and for a moment she felt small in his presence. Nonetheless, she summoned all the courage she had and spoke. "We need to talk, Ethan. It's important." He raised his eyes, surprised by her tone, and gestured for her to close the door. He sat down behind his desk, crossing his hands on it, as if preparing to hear a business negotiation. Emily walked over to him, feeling her heart race, but she remained firm. "I'm pregnant," she said, letting the words out with firmness, though her heart felt like it might explode. The silence that followed seemed endless. Ethan stared at her, his unwavering expression giving way to a cold harshness. He remained motionless, and Emily wondered if he had even registered what she had just said. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, his icy gaze fixed on her. "This is unexpected," he murmured, his voice carrying a hardness Emily had never known. The tension in the air was thick, a wall of ice that seemed to grow between them, a barrier that, for him, was perhaps unbreakable. Ethan was a man of absolute control, and this revelation seemed to him a threat to the order he had built. "I imagine you've given some thought to this," he added, his tone cold, almost professional. Emily felt the sting of those words slice through her heart like a sharp blade, but she kept her composure. She knew she couldn't let his initial reaction weaken her. After all, she had prepared to face this battle, and she needed to be as cold and calculating as he was. "I know this changes everything," she said, her voice trembling but controlled, "but we can find a way to make this work. It doesn't have to be a problem for either of us." Ethan kept his gaze fixed on her, as if analyzing every word, every gesture. There was a mixture of disbelief and frustration in his eyes, as if he couldn't comprehend how something like this could have happened. "Do you understand what this means, Emily? The implications, the media, the company's reputation. As CEO, I can't afford a personal scandal." The coldness in his voice made Emily feel smaller with every word, but she knew she had to keep her stance to show that she, too, was willing to fight for this. "Ethan, I'm aware of the complications. That's why I came with a proposal. This baby can be our connection, an opportunity for us to support each other. I don't want to disrupt your life or your position at Hastings. Think of it as a chance to consolidate our partnership." He let out a bitter laugh, incredulous. "Partnership?" he repeated, his tone laced with irony. "This sounds more like a trap, Emily. Tell me, have you been planning this from the beginning?" His question hit her like a punch, an accusation that left her speechless for a moment. Emily wanted to respond, but she knew any explanation would sound empty. Ethan's gaze was one of relentless judgment, and she felt the distance between them growing into an abyss. Despite Ethan's biting words, Emily swallowed her pride and pressed on. "Ethan, I never intended for this to happen. I'm just trying to make the best of the situation we have. I believe we have more to gain together than apart. We can raise this child without interfering in your career, in your reputation. All I'm asking for is a chance to show you that this doesn't have to be a problem for either of us." Ethan watched her, and his expression softened slightly, as if he were considering her words. But the tension was still visible in every line of his face. Ethan had always been meticulous, a natural strategist, and now, faced with this situation, it was clear he was weighing every word Emily said, calculating the risks and benefits. The silence between them was overwhelming. Emily felt the pressure mounting, but refused to show any weakness. She knew this was a crucial moment, that any hesitation could compromise her chances. She decided to push just a bit further, in one last attempt to appeal to the human side of Ethan. "Think about it, Ethan," she said, softening her tone. "This baby could be a new chapter for both of us. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this work. I just need you to be with me on this." Ethan remained silent, his eyes locked on hers with an almost cruel intensity. He didn't seem to be budging, but after a few moments, he let out a heavy sigh. "If I agree to this situation, everything will be done on my terms, Emily. I don't accept surprises, and I won't tolerate disloyalty. You need to understand what that means. Emily nodded slowly, swallowing the pain his words caused. Her involvement with Ethan had always been a stepping stone, but now it felt like an emotional and professional trap. She knew that by accepting his terms, she was sacrificing her own independence, parts of her dreams. Yet, she also knew she was willing to endure any sacrifice to secure a future for herself and the child. As she left his office, the sense of victory felt bitter. She knew she had reached an agreement with Ethan, but the price was high, perhaps too high. She felt like she was caught in a dangerous game where the rules were controlled by a man who didn't trust her, who saw her as a threat, and who now imposed a suffocating condition on her. The walk back to her office felt endless, each step a reminder that revealing her pregnancy had placed her in a more vulnerable position than she had ever imagined. Emily and Ethan's relationship turned into a roller coaster of contradictory emotions. He treated her with the usual formality, but now with an added layer of watchfulness, as if he calculated every move, every word they exchanged. It was a dangerous dance where any slip could compromise everything they were trying to keep in check. However, Emily began to sense that there was something more behind his coldness and caution, something deeply rooted in Ethan's past. He seemed to be a man surrounded by shadows she didn't yet understand. Ethan was an enigma. He never spoke about his personal life, and any attempt Emily made to broach the subject was immediately brushed off, as if his past were forbidden territory. Yet, small fragments started to surface, little by little, through rumors or offhand comments from colleagues. Emily overheard, almost by chance, that Ethan came from an aristocratic family, the Blakes, an old and influential lineage that had always been involved with the British elite. The family held a strong social presence, but Ethan seemed to keep a rigid distance. Something had happened, something that had driven him away from this family circle. Curious and perceptive, Emily decided to dig deeper. She hired a private investigator to uncover details of Ethan's childhood and the reason for his estrangement from the Blakes. She knew that the more she knew about him, the more control she could have over the situation. However, what she discovered left her shaken. Ethan had grown up in an oppressive environment, surrounded by a strict, affectionless upbringing. His father, Edward Blake, was a cold, severe man, known for his inhuman demands and relentless perfectionism. From a young age, Ethan had been subjected to a grueling routine of studies and social obligations, all with the goal of molding him into the perfect successor. But over time, the pressure became unbearable. Ethan was deprived of any genuine affection, taught not to trust anyone, to see the world as a game of power where emotions were weaknesses to be crushed. Emily was moved upon learning all of this. In part, it explained his reluctance to start a family. Ethan had learned that connections were traps, that to love and be loved was a vulnerability he couldn't afford. Perhaps, she thought, the man she saw every day still bore the scars of a childhood marked by loneliness and coldness. Something tightened in her chest, and for the first time Emily felt she was beginning to see Ethan beyond the role of the distant, controlling CEO. She was facing a man who, deep down, had lost the ability to trust, who had learned to survive by shutting out any trace of emotion. When they met again, Emily observed Ethan in a new light. It was as if he was constantly wearing armor, an invisible barrier that prevented any genuine closeness. During a particularly tense meeting, she couldn't resist and decided to take a risk, asking him a simple question that would test how vulnerable he was willing to be with her. "Do you ever miss having family close by?" she asked, choosing her words carefully. Ethan looked at her, surprised by the question. His face remained impassive, but she noticed a slight hesitation in his gaze, as if, for a brief moment, a fraction of that wall was breaking. "Family is just a web of expectations and demands," he replied, his tone filled with bitterness. "I don't miss that." Emily felt the hidden pain in his words and decided that this could be a point of connection between them. She knew that if she could earn his trust, she would not only gain an opportunity for control, but perhaps a chance to build something more solid with him. This realization confused her. Initially, their relationship had been a calculated strategy, but now it was blending with feelings she hadn't expected to have. In the midst of these reflections, she was surprised when one night, Ethan called her into his office, where for the first time, he seemed less like a CEO and more like someone seeking a solution to a personal problem. He began the conversation directly. "I've thought about our situation." His voice was calm, but she could feel the weight behind each word. "I have no intention of making this public. The company, my image, everything would be at risk. So I've come up with a solution that will allow us to move forward without conflict." Emily prepared herself to hear what he had to say, already aware that, coming from Ethan, it would likely involve some condition. He looked her in the eyes with an expression that combined authority and coldness. "I want us to keep a discreet relationship. In return, I'll make sure you're promoted and that you're financially supported during the pregnancy and after the birth." He paused, watching her reaction. "That's my limit." The proposal sounded as calculated as he was. It was as if their relationship were a transaction, a corporate agreement. Emily swallowed hard, feeling a pang of frustration and sadness. She had hoped that perhaps, knowing about the baby, he might open up in some way, allow for a more genuine connection. But here was Ethan, proposing a cold alliance, treating their personal involvement like a contract. Even so, she knew this was her best chance for advancement. Agreeing meant securing her professional and personal future alongside the most powerful man at Hastings Corporation. "I agree," she replied, keeping her voice firm, though her heart felt divided. She was grateful for the opportunity for growth, but at the same time, she knew that this discreet relationship placed her in a vulnerable position, subject to his rigid terms. The following days were intense. The agreement between them seemed sealed, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling of discomfort. Ethan continued to keep her close in meetings and company decisions, and the promised promotion came quickly, placing her in a prominent position. To her colleagues, she was just an employee who had earned the CEO's trust. But deep down, Emily knew her relationship with Ethan was more profound and complex. A tightrope walk where a single misstep could jeopardize everything. However, over time, she began to realize that Ethan's calculated coldness affected her more than she wanted to admit. In moments of solitude, she questioned her choices, trying to understand just how far she was willing to go. Her relationship with Ethan had become a web in which she was trapped, torn between the ambition that had always guided her and the complex feelings that now began to emerge. She felt as if, in some way, she was drowning in a sea of decisions that had stripped her of the control she always believed she had. One night, as she was leaving the office, she stopped to look at her reflection in the glass, trying to recognize the woman she had become. She wondered if, in her pursuit of ascension and control, she had ironically become a prisoner of her own ambition. She knew Ethan would never give up his own interests and that she would always be a manipulable piece in his game of power. Yet, there was something about this complexity that attracted her, as if seeing Ethan up close with his flaws and fears had awakened a side of her she didn't know. Emily continued in her new position at Hastings Corporation, aware that she was more entangled in Ethan's life than she had ever imagined. The agreement between them seemed solid, but there was something in her daily routine that left her feeling uneasy, like a cloud hanging over her constantly. Everything she had ever wanted was finally within reach: prestige, financial security, and the chance to rise in the company. However, the emptiness she felt alongside Ethan was like an increasingly deep abyss. During a lunch break at one of the quiet restaurants she frequented, Emily had a surprise that shook her to the core. While scanning the menu, she heard a familiar voice that made her freeze. Turning around, she found herself face to face with Daniel Cooper, her old love and a renowned lawyer in London. He was as elegant and imposing as she remembered, with the same kindness and attentive gaze. He was a stark contrast to Ethan. Where Ethan was enigmatic and cold, Daniel had always been charismatic and open. Emily. He looked surprised, but his sincere smile quickly brightened his face. Unable to contain her emotions, she returned the smile, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. For a few moments, she forgot everything. The agreement with Ethan, the shadows hanging over her life, the burden she carried in secret. Here was someone who truly knew her, someone who had loved her before ambition and plans had reshaped her. They sat down to lunch together, and the conversation flowed as easily as it had years ago. Daniel shared his successful career as a lawyer, and amid laughter and memories, he mentioned that he had never stopped thinking about her. There was sincerity in his words, a depth that Emily missed in her life. It was as if he were an echo of who she had been before losing herself in her own plans for power. Amid the chaos and manipulation, there was Daniel, like an anchor in a turbulent sea. "If you ever need anything, Emily, you know I'm here, right?" he said, his eyes fixed on hers, filled with genuine concern that completely disarmed her. Deep down, she knew she still felt something for him. It was a latent feeling, a flame that had never been completely extinguished. Yet at the same time, her mind pulled her back to the complicated reality she was in, her pregnancy, the pact with Ethan, her rise at Hastings. All of it was part of who she had become, and somehow she felt that Daniel was a link to a part of herself she had left behind. Returning to work that afternoon, Emily was overwhelmed with a quiet sense of guilt. Her reunion with Daniel had stirred something in her, and now she felt even more torn between the life she was building with Ethan and the possibility of a simpler, more sincere future with someone like Daniel. She knew her feelings were being tested in a cruel way. That appearance from her past couldn't have come at a worse time. As Emily faced this inner conflict, something else was happening without her knowledge. Margaret Blake, Ethan's mother, had returned to London briefly, determined to re-establish certain family influences. Margaret was an aristocratic, controlling woman who had always kept a watchful eye on everything involving the Blake name. And during one of her visits to her son's office, she overheard a conversation that left her stunned. Ethan was speaking on the phone, and from his tense expression and brief words, it was clear to Margaret that he was involved in a delicate situation. "What do you want me to do, Emily? Don't you think I've done enough?" he said, his voice tinged with irritation and tension. Listening discreetly, Margaret understood immediately that this was something personal. She stayed to hear more until the words baby and responsibility reached her ears. She didn't need to hear anything else to understand. Her son was entangled in a situation that could threaten the Blake family's reputation. After he finished the call, Ethan didn't notice his mother's presence, but Margaret had already confirmed her suspicions. The mere idea of an heir being born without her approval infuriated her. To her, it was an intolerable risk, something that could not only tarnish the family's name, but also jeopardize Ethan's career. The Blake she had raised so rigorously to maintain absolute composure and control in all aspects of his life. Margaret decided she would not allow a young woman like Emily, whom she considered a social climber, to stain her family's legacy. Meanwhile, Emily continued to find emotional support in Daniel, who made her question her choices more deeply each day. His messages had become constant, and with each encounter, Emily felt the guilt weighing heavier. Ethan remained reserved and distant, focused on maintaining appearances and their agreement, while Daniel offered her warmth and a chance to reconnect with the simplicity of a relationship built on genuine care. Amid her whirlwind of emotions, she felt something unexpected, a longing for a pure and uncomplicated love, something she had never felt with Ethan. During a conversation after work, Emily, overwhelmed with frustration and regret, confided in Daniel about the complexities of her life. She didn't reveal the truth about the baby, but confessed how lost she felt. Torn between a life that perhaps would never satisfy her and the desire to break free from the traps of her own ambition. Daniel listened attentively, his gaze full of understanding, his hand resting on hers as if trying to convey silent reassurance and support. "Emily, you don't have to carry this burden alone," he said, with a seriousness that touched her deeply. "Whatever it is, I'm here. You know I'll always be here." His words brought a comfort she didn't know she needed, but at the same time, they suffocated her with the weight of her guilt. She felt divided, trapped between two worlds, one where her future was secure alongside Ethan but lacked love, and another with Daniel, where her heart perhaps truly belonged, but that was uncertain and risky. While these conflicting feelings consumed her, Margaret Blake was determined to eliminate the threat that Emily posed. During a family meeting, she discreetly began reaching out to influential contacts, looking for ways to undermine Emily's position at Hastings Corporation. She was prepared to use every tool available to discredit her and, if necessary, to drive her out of Ethan's life entirely. Margaret knew she would have to act with surgical precision, leaving no trace, but she was willing to do anything to protect the Blake name, and even more to keep Ethan under her control, as she had always done. Margaret began investigating Emily's past, and with help from acquaintances, she uncovered information that could be used against her. Upon noticing Ethan's growing interest in the young woman, she realized she needed to act quickly. Emily would be removed from her path at all costs, and her pregnancy would remain a secret, since Margaret would never accept a grandchild born under what she deemed improper conditions. The last months of Emily's pregnancy were filled with tension and mystery. Her relationship with Ethan, already fragile, had become a cold formality, while Daniel's presence in her life continued to provoke conflicting emotions. She tried to focus on the future, certain that after the baby's birth, things would stabilize and she might find some kind of peace. Yet every time she looked at Ethan, doubt and discomfort grew within her. He was there, by her side, but it was as if an invisible wall separated them. The day of the birth arrived on a rainy night, with the London sky reflecting Emily's inner turmoil. Ethan was by her side, but his gaze was distant, almost absent. When the baby's cry finally echoed in the hospital room, Emily felt a mix of love and dread. She held her child in her arms, feeling the strength of unconditional love and, at the same time, the weight of the agreement that tied her to Ethan. The baby was the embodiment of a relationship built on secrets and ambitions, but as she looked at him, Emily realized that nothing else mattered. She was determined to fight for her child, regardless of the decisions that would follow. However, her relief was short-lived. Shortly after the birth, Ethan, with his usual coldness, announced his intention to conduct a DNA test to confirm paternity. The decision hit Emily like a punch to the stomach. She felt outraged, betrayed, as if he doubted her word and saw her as someone simply trying to take advantage of the situation. Still, she knew she had no choice. Agreeing to the test would bring the stability she needed and, perhaps, would be the only way to prove to Ethan that despite everything, she was honest. The following days were filled with anguish and apprehension. Emily watched the baby, searching for resemblances, trying to find any trace of Ethan in his features, hoping that the test was just a needless formality. Deep down, she wanted to believe that after the confirmation, perhaps Ethan would allow himself to be a real father, that the test would erase any doubts, and he would see her as someone he could trust. But as the day of the results approached, she felt a growing sense of dread, a feeling that something dark was looming. When the envelope with the results arrived, Emily sat beside Ethan in the doctor's office. The room was silent, heavy, and she felt her heart pounding, her breath shallow, her hands trembling. Ethan held the envelope with his usual impassive expression, but there was something in his eyes, a glint of tension she rarely saw. He opened the document, and as he read, his expression changed slowly, shifting from what seemed like confusion to absolute shock. He looked up, his eyes fixed on Emily, disbelief etched into every line of his face. "This is impossible," he murmured, his voice filled with a coldness that made Emily's blood run cold. "The test says that "The baby isn't mine. Emily, he's Daniel's child." The impact of his words was devastating. Emily felt her world shatter around her, as if the ground had opened beneath her feet. "No, this is a mistake," she whispered, unable to understand what he was saying. Daniel and I, this is impossible." Tears ran down her face, mingling with the disbelief and pain tearing through her heart. She knew she hadn't been with Daniel in recent months. She knew there was no way the baby could be his. The idea of betrayal was absurd, and yet the document in Ethan's hands felt like an inescapable sentence. Ethan stood up slowly, his face a mix of anger and distrust. "Emily, I've put up with a lot, made concessions I never thought I'd make, but this you can't expect me to tolerate." His voice was laden with a disdain Emily had never heard before. He looked at her as if she were a stranger, someone who had deceived him from the beginning. The pain she felt was unbearable, as if the weight of her own choices was crashing down on her. She tried to explain, stammering between sobs, but nothing made sense. "Ethan, I swear, this doesn't make sense. I was never with Daniel. There must have been a mistake, some kind of error." Her mind raced, searching for an explanation, but Ethan's words felt like blows, pushing her deeper into despair. "Emily, the test is clear, and if you want my advice, disappear from my life and from my child's. I was willing to do anything, but this is unforgivable." His words were a final blow, a cruel warning that their relationship, her career at Hastings, and her dreams were irreparably destroyed. Ethan's gaze was one of pure disgust, and she felt any hint of compassion or understanding between them shatter in that moment. Desperate and lost for answers, Emily left the office, her eyes swollen with tears, her body weak. She felt adrift, as if the very universe had turned against her. She tried to gather the strength to hold her head up and pull herself together, but the truth was that the impact of the test had left her devastated, unable to think clearly. She sought refuge in her apartment, where hours passed without her finding rest, silent tears marking the long night. By dawn, her mind still swirled with the question of how this could have happened. How could the test say that Daniel was the father? She tried to recall every detail from the past months, every moment with Ethan, searching for any error that could explain the situation. But all she saw was a nightmare, a cruel reality that seemed to have been orchestrated by forces she couldn't understand. Days later, desperate for answers, she reached out to Daniel. She shared the test results with him, each word leaving a bitter taste in her mouth. He listened quietly, not interrupting her, though she saw the confusion in his gaze. Daniel knew they hadn't been together recently, and so when he embraced her, it was a gesture of support, an attempt to calm her in the midst of chaos. "I believe you, Emily," he said, his voice steady. "But we have to find out what happened. This could be manipulated." His words sparked a glimmer of hope, a thought she hadn't considered until now. Manipulation. Someone, somewhere, had tampered with the test. And in the back of her mind, Margaret Blake's image appeared vividly. She recalled the threatening words of Ethan's mother, her disapproving looks, and her insistence on controlling Ethan's life. If anyone had a motive to manipulate this situation, it would be her. That night, Emily made a decision. She wouldn't allow the truth to remain hidden, wouldn't let her child's future be controlled by lies. Even though she didn't know how to prove her innocence, she was willing to fight with everything she had, ready to confront Ethan, Margaret, and anyone else behind this devastating scheme. The humiliation and pain Emily felt after her confrontation with Ethan continued to consume her. She could hardly breathe when she remembered the cold, merciless words he had spoken. The man who had once been her ally, who had made her believe that her dreams of advancement and success were finally within reach, now saw her as a betrayer. Yet, as devastated as she was, Emily wasn't one to give up in the face of injustice. She knew something was wrong, something that defied any logical explanation. She refused to let her child's fate be determined by a cruel lie. Determined to uncover the truth, she embarked on an obsessive search for answers. Her first move was to return to the clinic where the DNA test had been conducted. She used all her persuasive skills to try to speak directly with the doctor in charge, but her efforts were thwarted. The test's confidentiality was strictly enforced, and no one was willing to provide any information beyond the result itself. Emily felt helpless, but she knew she had to dig deeper. Her intuition told her that this situation had been meticulously crafted by someone who wanted her out of Ethan's life. The following weeks were filled with discreet, relentless investigation. Emily spent hours combing through old contacts, seeking anyone who might have a connection to the Blake family. Then, in the midst of her searches, she remembered an old college friend, Sarah, who had once worked as an assistant at one of the clinics used by the Blakes in London. Emily arranged to meet Sarah in a quiet cafe, and after a brief exchange of pleasantries, she began probing, sharing her story in broad strokes and highlighting her suspicions about the test manipulation. Sarah listened in silence, her face showing surprise and curiosity, but finally she relented. "I've heard rumors about Margaret Blake, that she's always had total control over any situation involving the family. She has connections in countless circles and doesn't hesitate to do whatever it takes to protect what she sees as the honor of the Blakes," Sarah said, her expression tense. "It's hard to believe she would manipulate a test like that, but it wouldn't be impossible. Margaret has more influence than you might realize." Sarah's words only confirmed Emily's suspicions. She knew that Margaret Blake had always resented her, viewing her as an intruder who was trying to seize what Margaret believed rightfully belonged to her family. Emily was thoughtful for a moment before an idea occurred to her. She thanked Sarah and, that same day, began making a series of discreet calls until she found someone with confidential information about the clinic where the test had been conducted. A few days later, Emily got in touch with an employee from the clinic, someone who had previously expressed dissatisfaction with the Blake family's strict control. Emily approached him cautiously, offering a generous sum for any information he could provide. Initially, the man hesitated, but her persistence, along with the financial incentive, convinced him to talk. Margaret Blake visited the clinic a few weeks before the test was conducted, he admitted, looking around to make sure no one was listening. She had a private meeting with the clinic's director. After that, a few employees were reassigned or transferred, and the director himself supervised your child's DNA test. "I've never seen such interference." His words sparked a fire in Emily. She now had proof that Margaret Blake had manipulated the test, that this ruthless woman, fearing her grandchild would be born to someone she deemed unworthy, had used her power to shatter Ethan's trust and drive them apart. Emily's blood boiled at the thought that her child's life had been deliberately twisted into a power game, all to ensure she would never get near the Blake family's inheritance. But Emily knew that simply having this information wasn't enough to expose Margaret. She needed something more concrete, something that would leave no room for doubt and would reveal the truth to Ethan. She devised a careful plan, intending to use Margaret's own arrogance against her. Knowing the matriarch well, Emily felt confident that Margaret would never consider her enough of a threat to hide evidence of her interference. Emily arranged a private meeting with Margaret, convincing her that she accepted her victory and wanted to make peace for the sake of her son's future. Margaret accepted the invitation with a calculated smile, confident that the young woman had finally been subdued. On the day of the meeting, Emily arrived at the restaurant with her head held high, though every fiber of her being was seething with contained rage. They sat across from each other, and Margaret stared at Emily with her usual icy superiority, her gaze clearly conveying that she saw herself as untouchable. But Emily was determined to unmask her. "Margaret," Emily began, her voice calm but filled with tension, "I came here because I want you to know I've decided to stop trying to get close to Ethan. I understand that you'll do whatever it takes to keep us apart, to protect your family's name. So here I am, to make peace." Margaret held her gaze, though Emily noticed a slight hesitation in her expression. a sign that her words had piqued her interest. Emily continued, casting a carefully laid trap. I know you don't hold back to ensure things go your way, including manipulating a DNA test to keep Ethan from me and our child. The accusation hung in the air like a veiled threat, and Margaret's face tightened. But true to her pride, she allowed herself a faint smile of disdain. Do you really think you're important enough for me to go to such lengths? But yes, Emily, there are certain truths Ethan would never understand. And I did what I had to do to make sure an ambitious woman like you would never have control over what's mine. She'd taken the bait. Emily felt a surge of victory in her chest, but she kept her expression neutral, feigning a look of resigned defeat. Margaret was brimming with confidence, unaware that in that moment she was being recorded. The matriarch's own words would be her undoing. Back at home, Emily played back the recording and confirmed she had the evidence needed to expose Margaret's actions. She knew Ethan would have to hear it, that no matter how much he despised her now, the truth would force him to confront the cruelty and calculated nature of his own mother. She waited for the right moment, and a few days later asked Ethan to meet her, saying she had something important to show him. He agreed to meet, though he remained guarded. Emily handed him the recording, and as he listened to his mother's words, disbelief and fury washed over his face. The blow that Margaret had so feared was now right in front of him, with all its implications. The atmosphere at the Blake mansion was tense when Ethan confronted his mother, Margaret. She sat in her study, her expression still carrying her usual icy control, though there was a new hint of worry in her eyes. Ethan stood before her, holding his phone with the recording Emily had given him, his mother's words echoing in his mind. He had never imagined she would go to such lengths, manipulating his own child's life to maintain a spotless image. Margaret, he began, his voice steady but filled with a disdain she had never heard from him. I've always respected you, adhered to the family's decisions because I thought it was part of what would make me a true Blake. But now I see I was blind. She met his gaze, the frost in her eyes beginning to crack. Ethan, everything I did was to protect what we built. You don't understand the threat this woman represents. Emily is a gold digger. Ethan shook his head, disappointment etched into his expression. You're wrong. Emily would never have betrayed me. You're the one who played us, who used my own child as a pawn in your twisted games. He took a step closer, resolute. Emily and I, we have our flaws, but at least we're honest about them. You've lost me, Margaret. His words struck Margaret like a fatal blow. For the first time, her control crumbled, and she realized she had lost the son she had spent her life trying to mold. He looked at her one last time, feeling freed from the chains of expectation and manipulation. He left the mansion with a newfound determination, ready to move forward and leave behind the rigid expectations of the Blake family. Emily was waiting in a small park when Ethan arrived. Her heart pounded as she saw him approach. She didn't know what his decision would be, but noticing the look on his face, something within her shifted. The usual coldness had vanished. In its place was a sincerity and a hint of vulnerability. I'm sorry, Emily, he said, stepping closer with a calm that surprised her. I was wrong in so many ways. If it weren't for my pride and the expectations I carried, we would have never reached this point. My mother, she's part of a past I'm ready to leave behind. I want a new life, and I want you to be part of it, if you're willing. Emily stood in silence for a few moments, processing his words. She felt relief, but also the weight of all the decisions she had made to reach this point. In that instant, she realized that amidst all the chaos, a genuine love had grown between them, silent and unwavering. Ethan, she replied, feeling tears gather in her eyes. I made mistakes too. I entered your life with ambitions, ready to use any chance to achieve my goals. But over time, I realized what I truly wanted was far beyond power or status. I wanted something real. He took her hand, and together they made a silent pact. They were ready to face the world, and the Blakes, for a love that, though born in confusing circumstances, had endured all the lies and manipulations. Ethan knew his decision meant giving up the Blake legacy, but he didn't care. For the first time, he was ready to build something new, a home based on truth and respect. They moved to a modest home on the outskirts of London, away from the aristocratic halls and watchful eyes. They devoted themselves to the baby, finding happiness in the little things, laughter, first steps, and sleepless nights shared together. They built a new beginning, together, far from the power plays. What had once been a strategy became a genuine, fulfilling life, where both had learned to value the love they'd built through the battles they had faced.